Strategic workforce planning, unlocking future capabilities to drive business success. My name is Gillian Pillans. I'm Research Director at CRF and one of the co-authors of the research, which hopefully you will have received earlier this week, which we'll be discussing today. This is obviously a really hot topic because it's one of our biggest turnouts for any of our events. So hopefully we are meeting a need. It's a topic of interest in your organisation. So thanks for spending the time with us today. What we're going to cover in the next 90 minutes, I'll give you a brief overview of the research and share some of the key findings. We will be then diving a little bit deeper into some of the key challenges, the key barriers that we found in our research that organisations are facing. We will also, as you know, those of you who have attended CRF webinars, you know that we like to make them as interactive as possible. So we'll be inviting you to share your experiences and to put any questions to our panel of experts. And in the spirit of interaction, I'd like to kick off a poll. We're very conscious that this is a hot topic in organisations, but some organisations are very experienced in strategic workforce planning and others are setting out on their journey. So we'd really like to get a sense as we kick off of the level of maturity in the audience. So we'd ask you to respond to a poll question, which, Will, if you can bring that up for us, please. The question is, very simply, how would you rate your experience of strategic workforce planning? Is it non-existent, fairly limited? Are you moderately experienced? Are you fairly experienced, or are you an expert? So if you could take a moment just to tell us where you are at this stage in your journey on strategic workforce planning, that would be great. If we can bring up the results, we are, there's about just under half of the audience judging your experiences as fairly limited. And only 1% would consider themselves to be experts. So we're hopefully all going to learn together today. So thanks for sharing those thoughts with us. So I'm going to take the next few minutes just to share some of the headlines from the research. Where I'd like to start really is just before we get into what is strategic workforce planning and how do we do it, I think we need to start with the definition, so being really clear what we're talking about. And in the research, we defined strategic workforce planning as it's a process that's designed to align a company's people and organisation with its business direction. And the people and organisation bit is really important because it's not just about, for example, hiring people or learning and development. It can also mean looking at how are we structured as a business? Does our operating model enable us to develop the capabilities that we need for future success? So strategic workforce planning, it looks at what's required from the workforce perspective to build and sustain competitive advantage. And it's also about unearthing and testing assumptions and highlighting risks. So the word of risk will come up a lot in this discussion. So it's really focusing on the strategic organizational capabilities that the business will need to master to accomplish its goals. And it's the small number of big bets or bold moves that will be required to deliver those capabilities. So again, another message that I think we'll be coming back to today is it's really about prioritizing those actions and those activities which will have the biggest impact on the organization's ability to execute its strategy. And it's also about taking a future back perspective. So it's looking at what actions will we need to take to achieve that end goal that we're looking at reaching through our business strategy. So it's forming a bridge between the business and the people strategy. So that's what we mean when we're talking about strategic workforce planning. What we did in this research, we've put together a model which will hopefully help you in your thinking as you work out your own business methodology for how to do strategic workforce planning. And it really sets out some key questions that you need to answer in defining your strategic workforce plan. So I'll give a bit of an overview of the model and the methodology, and then we'll be dipping into some parts of this in more detail as we. What we discovered is that there are some areas where organisations particularly struggle, so we'd like to sort of home in on some of those areas in this session. I think one thing to emphasise before I kind of get into the steps is to highlight that although we show this as a linear process, in practice it's a highly iterative process, and you may have to go around the loop several times. You may have to adapt and adjust your approach as you go. And I think another really important point to emphasise is that strategic workforce planning, it's really about systems thinking. So thinking about the organisation as a whole system. So any action that you take in one area is going to have effects elsewhere. So for example, one of the examples we talk about in the report is organisations might be looking to build consumer insight as a key capability. And that might mean hiring or retraining data analytics experts, obviously in the domain of strategic workforce planning. But it could also mean things such as acquiring new technology that allows you to gather and analyse customer data. It might mean changing organisational processes to be more customer-centric. Or it might mean, from a governance point of view, looking at decision rights so that frontline employees are empowered to use data in real time as they deal with customers. So you have to think across multiple elements. It's not just about specific actions around, for example, hiring new employees. And also you need to think across the whole employment value proposition. So we might need to think about the physical location of work, where we're based in order to attract the right people. Examples this week of, for example, Goldman Sachs looking to set up new locations in Birmingham to attract technology staff. We need to think about rewards, the sort of organisation culture that we might need to develop to support new ways of working, etc., etc. So very much kind of looking across the whole system together. The other factor to take into account is that the organisation is also constantly interacting with its external environment, so it's really important to factor that in as well. So I'll walk through the steps briefly, as this will not necessarily be a surprise to those of you who are familiar with CRF's other work. The start point for this is the business strategy. So we're looking to take a future back view of where we need to get to, and then the steps that need to be put in place to get us there. The first question we really need to consider is, what capabilities do we need to build to deliver the strategy? So what do we need to develop to build or sustain our competitive advantage? The next step in the process is thinking about what internal capability do we have today? So we need to understand the current workforce and how that's changing to assess whether we have the people we need to meet the future demand, both potentially in terms of numbers, but also in terms of factors like skills. So we'll be talking a bit more as we go through about how we do that segmentation of getting breaking down the workforce into sort of manageable chunks. The next question is, what does the external labour market look like? So we need to get a picture of what's the future supply going to be, so we can understand where there are needs that we need to fill. How are we going to go about doing that? Can we rely on the external market? Do we need to be building our own capability internally? And then we need to bring these together to model where are there gaps between the supply that we have and the demand that we will have in the future, and to highlight areas where actions are going to be needed. And having identified the gaps, then we need to move into thinking about, well, how do we plan to fill those gaps? What actions do we need to be gearing up to take to address the issues that are raised in the planning? And this is not necessarily just about recruitment or development. I mean, those are the first two. There's a series of different actions we might take: buying in talent from outside, building internally. Those are some of the more obvious actions. Developing reskilling pathways potentially to transition people from one skill set to another. But we also need to be thinking more broadly. For example, do we need to borrow people by dipping into the contingent workforce? Do we need to be thinking about outsourcing to meet some of our needs? What about retention? Do we need to update our employment value proposition or our reward strategies to make sure that we can attract and retain the people we need? And also looking more broadly at work design. We talk about this in the research quite a bit as well. Are there opportunities to automate or redesign work so we can deliver things in different ways that don't necessarily involve hiring new people or developing new skill sets? There might be other ways of getting the work done that we need to do. And underpinning the whole thinking around strategic workforce planning is the idea of risk. So we need to be thinking about where are the critical risks to execution of the strategy. So the actions that we might take and the risks to being able to deliver our business strategy are essentially two sides of the same coin. And part of the work we need to be doing in strategic workforce planning is identifying, working out how we can mitigate the key risks that might be associated with the different courses of action that we might take. It's about building a safety net so we're prepared for things that might get in the way of us being able to accomplish our goals. The final stage of the process is evaluation. So, and it's a bit that's often sort of forgotten about or underplayed in the process. But how do we know that the plan we've put together is effective? Is it meeting the needs of critical stakeholders? And then that in turn then feeds back into a feedback loop that allows the process to be continuously improved and updated. So learning from experience, improving as we go along. What we're going to be talking about in the rest of the session is to really home in on some of the barriers to success. And there's some particular ones that came out of the research that we find that organisations commonly face. The first is around how we make the connection between business strategy and strategic workforce planning. So how do we go about identifying the strategic capabilities that we need? What's HR's role in having that conversation in the organisation? How can HR engage the business in this work? And how does strategic workforce planning fit with business planning? And what even should we call it? We see lots of organisations are struggling to get traction around strategic workforce planning, and it can quite often take a few attempts to get it to work effectively in the organisation. So how do we position with key stakeholders and how do we get key business colleagues involved in the process and owning the process are really important considerations as we design what we do. And then another challenge that organisations face is how to make sense of the workforce. So the comment that came up a lot was we started off trying to boil the ocean, and it was too much to do in one go. So we need to think about how do we chunk down the organisation into manageable pieces of work. So how do we really focus in on those parts of the workforce that will make the biggest impact on being able to deliver our strategy? And another consideration is how do we make the process sufficiently agile and adaptive to suit the fast pace of change in organisations today, so that it's an enabler of change. It's not a bureaucratic process that slows things down. And another challenge, I think, is how do we make sure that that strategic workforce planning actually leads to action, and it's not just sort of a job that we do and then it's sort of left on a shelf to be forgotten about. How do we make sure that the actions we identify then get fed into business planning, into budgeting, so that the resources are in place to make those actions come to life? And then how do we upskill HR to do this work effectively? We see it's a particular skill set that's required to do this work well, and it's not necessarily something that's always a natural strength for HR. So we need to think about what are those capabilities for the HR function as well. So hopefully we'll be touching on those points as we go through. And we're also really keen to hear about what are some of the challenges that you're facing in your organisations. So do raise questions around specific considerations for your organisations or your experiences, and hopefully we'll be able to get to cover those through the session. And now I'm going to hand over to our first guest, who's one of my co-authors on the research, Jill Foley, and Jill's going to talk about how we get from business strategy to identifying strategic capabilities and on to identifying critical talent. So Jill, over to you.
Thanks, Gillian. Can you all see the slide that's in front? Great. Thanks very much, and hello everybody. I'm very glad to be here talking about one of my favourite subjects today. I'm the managing partner of On3, and we're a consultancy specialising in strategic talent planning. So I'm going to try and share with you some of the scars and the wisdom, such as it is, that I've developed over a couple of decades of working in this space. And I want to start by acknowledging that strategic workforce planning might be critical, but it can also be quite daunting work because of the scope of the work that you need to do and the range of activities that are included if you're doing this from end to end. So if you reflect on the model that Gillian has just walked us through, we start at the intersection of business strategy and organizational planning, and the process takes us right through at the other end to defining and executing what could be quite granular talent management activities. So at one end, we're working with really big questions that require deep work, and where we're inviting leaders to consider the workforce as a total asset and make strategic choices and investment decisions that future-proof the business. And at the other end, we're doing work that is much closer to individuals and impacts the way that we ask managers to develop and optimize the potential and performance of their people. So it's quite a complex and very comprehensive sequence of activities. And that makes it challenging work for HR. It also makes it confusing for leaders if we're trying to do everything all at once. And what's clear from the research is that there are a couple of points on that journey that are particularly challenging, and that's where I'm going to focus this part of the discussion. So I'm going to share with you a couple of the tools that we use that can be used in a range of different ways at critical points in the process. So first of all, I'm going to talk about how you translate business strategy into future capabilities. So the question we're really working with here is, what are the core capabilities that we need to deliver our strategy? Or if you put it another way, what are the things that this organization needs to be brilliant at to be successful in the future? And it's worth just calling out here the difference between core capabilities and skills, because leaders often find this a concept that's confusing to grasp. So skills are the domain of individuals, whereas capabilities are the domain of organizations. And as Gillian has described, if you're building an organizational capability, you will obviously need to pay attention to individual skills, but you might need to look broader at some of the other ways in which your organization is set up for success. So understanding core capabilities has implications for the way that you design your operating model, as well as the way that you plan and manage your workforce. The other place that I'm going to touch on is the part where you translate those core capabilities into a differentiated talent plan. So one that recognizes the roles that will make a disproportionate contribution to future value, and that focuses on closing the gap between the talent that you need for the future and the people that you have in the organization today. So those are the two places that I'm going to focus in on in this part of the conversation. And the key, as Gillian has described, the key in both of these places is that you consider the strategic workforce planning questions in a future back way. So what does that look like? So the structured set of questions that we're offering here give you a way of translating your strategic requirements into a picture of what are the core capabilities that we need to build for the future. So this can be done as a conversation, it can be done as a workshop, but in essence, the part that HR plays in this is to facilitate quite a deep conversation which looks out into the future and then works back from the strategy to understand what the implications are for both workforce, organization design, and how big are the shifts that we might need to make. So we start on the right-hand side with North Star. So the questions that we're looking at here are, what's the ambition of the business? What does good look like in, let's say, a period that's 3 to 5 years out into the future? And the most important question of all is, what's at stake? So what would success make possible that otherwise wouldn't happen? And conversely, what would the consequences of failure be? Which helps to anchor us into this notion of where are the biggest risks and where are the things that we really need to prioritize. Working backwards from that, we can then look at what are the quantifiable goals that we need to reach along the way to realizing our North Star. And this, in my experience, will be the straightforward part of the conversation, because most leaders are clear about the direction of travel and what they're trying to achieve, at least in the medium term. The part where this becomes more difficult is where we then unpack each of those goals to understand, so what are the conditions that we need to create in order to be able to deliver the goals that we've set ourselves? And what does that mean are the critical things that we need to either start doing or fix or change about the way that we work? So what are the imperatives that will enable us to create the conditions for success? Then we can start to look at, so if we are to deliver those imperatives, what's the work that we need to do brilliantly, which is the beginnings of our core capabilities, and how is that different from what we do today? So I'm going to share an illustration with you, which is based on a hospitality brand, a well-known restaurant brand, just to give you a sense of how this plays out. So this is a brand that has enjoyed 20 years of growth, and they've reached growth, or they've delivered growth by opening 25 new restaurants each year. And that's driven sustained profitable growth for all of those 20 years. They're reaching saturation point in the UK marketplace at the moment, and the dynamics of their target market and their tastes are changing. So they're just starting to see the beginnings of a plateau in their market share. So they've been thinking about how do they drive growth for the future and what does that mean for them? So they've made a couple of strategic decisions around shifting from being a purely eat-in or dine-in restaurant to transitioning to multi-channel, so embracing delivery, but also a grocery channel, so selling their products via the big supermarket chains. And they're also going to take the brand to the US. They see that as a potential growth market for them. So in terms of the goals that they've set, they're looking for 20% revenue growth over the next 3 years. And in the UK, that will come primarily through new channels. And they're aiming to get to what they describe as proof of concept in the UK, which is establishing 10 sites and getting them profitable. So when we unpack those goals and we start to look at, so what are the critical things that will create the condition for that success? Some different and new work starts to emerge for them. So one of the early things that they've had to work on is establishing a commercially robust partnership with one of the big food delivery aggregators. They've had to do a significant amount of work to scale up their manufacturing capacity to meet the anticipated growth across grocery channels. They've been piloting new formats in the US, and in the UK estate, they've been making some really subtle but quite profound shifts in the way they run the restaurants to make sure that they can maintain a good dine-in experience at the same time as feeding the delivery demand. So when you start to look at those imperatives, it points towards some different work from the work that has driven success historically. So commercial partnership management becomes critical, supply chain and manufacturing excellence becomes more critical, deeper, broader consumer insight, and so on. So what this is doing for them is it's changing, if you like, the graphic equalizer of the things that are going to be important in the future. And it's helping them think through, right, where do we need to dig deeper to understand what the specific workforce implications are. So this is an illustration of what working future back looks like in a way that helps to surface where those core capabilities might be. What we then can move on to do is map those core capabilities to understand where the value is coming from and where the complexity will lie in the future. So just to briefly explain the axes on the middle, the vertical axis looks at work through the lens of how is the work contributing to future success. So we think about this in 3 segments, where in the top row, there is work that you do that will create or unlock new value. So it's really important work, but it's not urgent. It probably won't yield any benefit until some point out into the future. So if you were an oil company, this is where exploration would sit. If you were a pharmaceutical company, this is where research and development would be. The middle row that we call value optimizing are the things that you do that drive in-year performance by leveraging the assets that you've already created. So if this work isn't done well, you will see the impact of that far sooner than if value creating work isn't done well. And then in the bottom row, we talk about work that is value enabling. So it's in essence the things that you do that make everything else possible. And then the bottom axis goes from familiar complexity at one end, where you're probably talking about the work that is mature and stable, where you have a blueprint for success that exists already. And towards the right-hand side then is where we put the work that is dealing with unfamiliar complexity. So where you're trying to build new capabilities or do things that you've not done before, or where the context in which you're working is ambiguous, or there's kind of significant risk involved. So mapping the core work and the core capabilities in this way starts to give you some insights about where future risk might lie, what the nature of that risk is, and therefore how you might need to mitigate. So for instance, work that sits in the top right part of this model, that's where potentially the work will unlock disproportionate future value. But it's also where you carry greatest risk. If you don't build those capabilities in the right time and in the right place, you'll damage future performance. Whereas in the bottom left-hand side of the quadrant, if those capabilities, if you allow those to diminish, that's where there's the potential for value destruction. Okay. So when we think about the restaurant chain and how their work matched, they went into this exercise with a very confident assertion that the things that had made their business successful in the past lay within the property function. So the ability to find new sites, develop really compelling restaurant design and build fast and high quality, and the rigor and the consistency of the kind of teams of people that ran the restaurant operation. So the going in position was, that's our core work, that's what makes us successful. Once we'd been through the future back structured questioning, what starts to emerge is a slightly different picture, which is actually the role of the property function in the future is going to be less significant than it's been in the past, because we're not going to be building as many new restaurants. Actually, the nature of that work changes to exploring and testing different formats in the future. The restaurant operating part of the business is the mature and stable part of the business. So it's going to continue to make a massive contribution, but it's not where the risk lies and it's not where future value is going to come from. The things that emerged in that top right-hand corner were around building consumer insight, managing commercial partnerships in a really outstanding way, and scaling up manufacturing. So for them, it's prompted quite a different lens on what's going to be important for the future and where their risks might lie. What you can then do with this model, which kind of uses it in a slightly different way, but it helps you then transition to what's the differentiated talent plan, is to use this to map and identify critical roles. So you're following the same structure and the same principles, but what you're mapping here are the roles that will deliver the work that drives value in the future. If you follow a similar set of principles, if you follow the axes in the same way, roles will fall into one of 4 segments. So in the top right are what we call pivotal roles. So these are the roles that they're in essence the game changers for the future. So they're the roles that have the potential to unlock disproportionate value and or create damage future performance. Very often in organizations, these are small emergent challenges because they're dealing with new work or different work. So it might be that you discover that they're not yet getting the visibility or the leadership attention, or there are even roles that don't exist yet because of that. So, so they're new and emergent and may not yet have the right visibility. The polar opposite of these are sustaining roles that sit on the left-hand side. So these are often the biggest roles in organizations, but they're dealing with the really mature parts of the business. So actually, the talent risks associated with those roles are relatively modest, in the sense that if one of those role holders were to move on or leave you altogether, it's unlikely to have an immediate impact on business performance because you have mature teams of people who will continue to do that work. And then in the middle L-shaped zone, you have roles that may be either dealing with really high risk endeavor or work that is deliberately and specifically driving growth through expanding your operation. And then at the bottom, as we've described, the enabling roles. So this can throw up some quite counterintuitive insights about the way that you're deploying the talent that you have today. So I think as a function, what we've become used to, or the trap that we've fallen into, is putting our best people into our biggest roles. Very often they sit in the sustaining part of the box. So actually the risks associated with those are relatively modest. What we might, what this starts to surface is to think about what actually are the skills and the qualities that we need to do the roles that sit on the right-hand side. And that might be the place where we can optimize the talents of the people that we have today. So start to think about whether those pivotal roles actually would be a better place for you to put some of your highest performing people with greatest potential. The kinds of capabilities, kind of skills that you need at either end of that complexity scale are quite different. The work that you do on the left-hand side is really about execution and continuous improvement, whereas on the right-hand side, role holders are having to do multiple things. They're having to think about what's the work that we need to do in the future. They're also having to figure out how do they deliver that work and execute at the same time. So the challenges at either end of that continuum are quite different. And they, as I say, they start to help you think about where does future risk lie. So I'm going to pause there with just a kind of to recap, and then I'm going to hand back to Gillian and take any questions. So with those two kind of models or tools in mind, the things that I would say are critical to think about are work the question, the big strategic workforce planning questions future back. So start with demand rather than supply. And I think that's a shift for many organizations based on traditional approaches. If you're thinking about how to make progress with this, I would strongly advocate that you work, first of all, to start changing the conversation with a light touch on process, because the processes implicit in this can be overwhelming for businesses. And to Gillian's point earlier, I would always align this with strategic planning rather than labeling it as an HR process. I have many times stepped into one of these future back conversations, which has been signaled as a workforce planning conversation. And what I step into are leaders who want to tell me all the new roles that they need filling and the people that we need to be hiring and the skills that we should be scaling up. And that's a long way from the conversation that gets you started in the right way. So I'm going to pause there and hand back to Gillian. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Jill. I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me as we were putting this research together was, and you used the word counterintuitive, and I think taking that future back view, sometimes it can flag up things that are really critical risks that you just wouldn't get to if you were extrapolating forward from today.
Right.
And I think it's often something that gets missed in this process, that you know, if there was one thing really to improve the process in organizations from what we've seen, it's really having that discipline about starting with the end point and working back from there. I'm very conscious of time, so I think what we'll do is we'll move along the agenda, and we'll come back to questions for Jill as we go through. Changing tack slightly, I said earlier, one of the challenges, and it's actually come out of questions in the chat as well, is how we get a handle on what we have today, and how we segment the workforce to get it, to wrestle it into some sort of manageable form where we can actually make sense of the data and start to identify, you know, where the critical actions might be. So I'm going to hand over to Wendy to sort of share some thoughts around, you know, how do we define critical workforce group? Perhaps looking at the broader workforce, not just at the leadership population and critical talent, but really looking at those critical workforce groups more broadly, and what might be some of the options around how we do that in practice. So over to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Gillian. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see fleeting faces every now and again. I'll share my screen in a moment. My name's Wendy Hirsh. I've worked on workforce planning along with other things for much of my working life. And I think this issue of how organizations grapple with conceptualizing the workforce in anything other than lots of organization charts is really what I'm going to talk about just for a few minutes. Like Jill, I'm going to go back to the main diagram that Gillian has built the research around and think about why is even having workforce groups or thinking about groups of people and groups of jobs so central to any sort of workforce planning. And if we look at this diagram, on the left-hand side, we have the business strategy, but I wish that most of the ones I saw were like the ones Jill has been talking about. I think a lot of business strategies are unbelievably vague. They're vague about what the business really wants to do, but they're especially vague about who might do it. I read one a while ago that talked about getting into China, but it didn't say who was going to get into China. It didn't even say how they were going to get into China. So what Jill has been saying about the real importance of this interlinking of the strategy and the sort of operating model is perhaps what we call it of the business. So we're often working off a strategy that's unbelievably vague. And then at the far end, as Gillian and Jill have already said, we are going to come up with actions, but again, they're different kinds of actions. In particular, some things you do might be about everybody. Many things you do, most things in fact, are about groups of people. And managers, of course, then attend to individuals within those groups. But often I find HR directors trying to jump from a very vague thing about the business to very specific actions, but they have no currency with which to answer any of the questions in the middle of the model. So as soon as you start working through the CRF model, if you're looking at internal capability, where is it that you're looking in the workforce for the capability that's of interest to the business? I know we have fantasies about having massive skill databases with all the skills that every person has. That is cloud cuckoo land and not very helpful. It's much more helpful to say we need a business capability. Where in our workforce is that capability likely to lie? And that means knowing in what groups in the workforce it lies. The same when we look externally. What does the external labour market look like? But the external labour market for who? For what kinds of people? Again, if you start going with granular skill lists at that point, it's just not practical. And particularly when you start looking at workforce gaps and how you fill gaps and at where the risks lie, in which part of our workforce are those gaps? Where do we link demand and supply? What are we missing? And for me, this idea of groups of people and groups of jobs is the only practical method I've found to be a currency that links demand and supply. This is what this group of jobs will look like in future. This is what we need from this group of jobs. This is what we need from these people. Now, do our current people have that stuff? Let's just look very fleetingly at a sort of massive capability challenge. I'm not an expert on COVID, so apologies to those in the audience who are, but we had a big capability issue. How do we get a whole country vaccinated? If you start mapping out the organizational capabilities, these are just some of them, but for each of them, we do know quite a bit about the different groups of people we look to within our model to do those things. Developing a vaccine, that doesn't come overnight. We had to look to scientists who had already spent their whole working lives knowing how to do exactly that thing. We also needed a Vice Chancellor of Oxford University who had the wit to realise that she had to give it, would have to be a woman, wouldn't it? She'd have to give them permission to start spending money before anyone was funding them. We had to make a vaccine, complex partnerships in play there. We had to have a regulatory system that managed it. Then we had to get the vaccines distributed. So you think, so who can distribute stuff? Do we need the army or don't we need the army? Is it going to be such a big challenge that we're looking at their capabilities? Then you have to actually get it to people, get it into people's arms. There are volunteers in there. There are general practitioners who, of course, already do it with flu. So actually Jill's point about complexity that you already understand, our primary healthcare system already has the capability to know how to vaccinate very large numbers of people, not quite as large as they're doing right now, but it's one of those well understood parts of the model. Mass vaccination centres, newer, but still ultimately operated by people who knew what they were doing. Then, of course, when you've done all that, you have to do it all over again. But I think I want to reinforce Jill's point that when you talk about an organisational capability, the operating model and the workforce groups you're interested in really go hand in hand. If we'd chosen a different operating model for vaccination, we would have had to have different groups of people involved in different places in different ways. Only at that point can you really get into the detail of the resourcing. How many volunteers do we need? Have we got enough doctors? No, we brought back a lot from retirement, but that again, we know how to do. So jumping straight from capability to skills really doesn't do the job. You really have to go through those intermediate stages. I just want to say a bit about how we define workforce groups for strategic workforce planning purposes. I'm not going to talk much about the diagram, we can come back to that later, but really one's thinking about chunks, as Gillian called them, I think, manageable chunks of the workforce. And when you think about your manageable chunks, the most obvious start point is where do we have groups of people and groups of jobs involved in roughly the same kinds of work? That means they could more or less do each other's jobs. But there are a few other things to think about. One is, do they behave in the same way? You may have two groups of people doing the same work, but one group turns over a lot more than the other. And in that case, you need to look at them separately. You need to understand those dynamics. You also need to know if you will treat them the same. For example, if you've got some sort of talent program that fast tracks some people, you may want to see those people as a workforce group because you'll be treating them differently. And finally, the one we normally forget, which is making sense externally. People who come to work for you need to be able to relate your organisation to the external market, and you need to understand what that external market is. Let's look then at what that means in practice. What it doesn't mean usually is cutting up the organisation by reporting lines, by departments, because you change those all the time, and they're not the best way of looking at what people actually do. They don't tell us about capability, they just tell us who your boss is. What tells us more about capability are the broad functions or occupations or professions, sometimes usefully called job families, that define very broad kinds of work, and then the very broad levels at which that work is done. One that isn't as often used as it should be are the role types within those groups. And the common example is, I was thinking about John, worked at BAE for many years. They would have had engineers, but at some levels there would be both engineers doing a lot of engineering and engineers mostly managing or leading. And yet often we clump those groups together when their capabilities are very different. That's what you work with most often, but there are some other bits that you can have fun with. Sometimes we really do need to know about small specialist skill groups within a job family. Sometimes, as in the big consulting firms, that's not so much about a sub-profession, but about a market they work with or a product they know about. You have to watch out for emergent functions or professions, either because your capabilities will need them or because they're emerging outside. One I'm looking at the moment with one organisation is the whole world of data science, of big data. Now that for them isn't a brand new area, but it is changing some of their existing skills, both in data analysis and in computer science, in the whole digital space. And so it is shifting boundaries between existing workforce groups, and maybe those workforce groups then need completely redefining. Sometimes we need to look at where people are working. It's going to be a huge issue the next few years. We want to look at the work patterns of people, part-timers, full-timers, contractors. We often forget to look at contractors properly. Sometimes it's important to look at demography, either because people behave differently or because there are underrepresented groups we are really keen to have more of in our workforce and to develop better. And although this looks complicated, sometimes you have to play with these a bit to find out which variables make a difference in your organization. You're not looking at all these things always and all the time. You're working out which ones affect your capability to resource, which ones represent risk. Finally, coming back to Jill's point, but in a slightly different way, Jill was talking about looking at risks lying in different places. On this chart, we have a similar axis to Jill's discussion about on the vertical axis about the business impact of a group of people and jobs. But on the horizontal axis, we have their availability, how hard it's going to be to resource those groups of jobs. And many organizations find the issue of critical workforce groups useful. It tells you where you put in more of your analysis, where you look more carefully at the workforce. And the highest risk groups are usually those that have a high business impact and are hard to get hold of. But the high business impact isn't just strategic, it's also operational. And the risk isn't always just in leaders and senior people, as I saw with the thinking about vaccination. It can be in very operational roles. I've covered a lot in a short time. I'm going to pass back to Gillian now to keep us on track.
Thank you, Wendy. We're going to come back to quite a few points, I think, that you've raised. And actually, it's really interesting what's coming through in the chat. I think Wendy and I had many discussions about this when we were working on the research about how you measure capability, how you measure skills, how you keep on top of what you have over a period of time. And that's certainly coming out of the chat, a comment from Kerry Nutley, and I think Joe Kelly's comment sort of alluding to that as well. How do we assess the level of internal capability? I'd like to come back to that in a few minutes in the discussion, but I thought what would be helpful actually is to bring what Wendy's just been talking about to life a little bit by asking our other panelists to comment on how they do it in their organisation. So we've got Emma from Tesco and John who led SWP at BAE Systems, two very different organisations in different sectors. But perhaps to comment on, you know, how do you segment the workforce? How do you prioritise where to focus? So maybe Emma, we can start with you. And I think another comment that's sort of come through the chat as well is how you sort of keep that dynamic as well as you go on. So Emma, maybe you can sort of share a bit of insight around how you do that in Tesco.
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, I'm Emma, the lead workforce planning manager at Tesco. So at Tesco we approach segmenting the workforce by department in the first instance, and primarily that's because we're a massive business at Tesco and we have kind of functional strategies that are defined. And so in order to kind of marry up the skills requirements and capability requirements in the future, we ensure that we align segmenting the workforce to the strategies that are being set at a departmental level. So we start by looking at kind of a broad functional approach and then break that down into job families as well. So using job families to look at people with similar skills, similar capabilities to then identify kind of who we need to focus on going forwards. And we actually use exactly the same matrix that Wendy has talked about today to identify those critical roles and skills, and then make sure that we focus on those kind of individuals or teams that sit in the top right corner of the matrix in terms of where we focus our energy going forwards, because those are the ones that are going to have either the biggest impact on the business strategy going forwards, or are going to be the ones that are going to be hardest to attract or develop internally. So that's our kind of approach to the question around how we sustain it. So we've definitely been tested in terms of how we sustain our approach to workforce planning as we've gone through COVID. And it's meant that, you know, some of the forecasts that we'd put in place in terms of the workforce demand have moved massively as we've had to respond to the pandemic. So we've made sure at Tesco that it's not a one-off exercise that we do with a particular area of the business, but actually we maintain that relationship with the business area and refresh the data on a regular basis so that we can respond to what might be happening in either the internal or the external market.
Okay, and I think the other thing we talked about is sort of approaching this on a kind of project by project basis as well. So taking more of a, rather than seeing it as a formal process, it can be much more dynamic and sort of project driven, depending on where the priorities are in the business at any point in time.
Yeah, exactly. So we tend to kind of approach each department or function as a separate project, and then that enables us to really tie into that functional strategy in order to identify what skills and roles are required. And then we do an exercise to kind of overlook all of the different projects that we've done over the last 12 months, identify where there might be similarities across the different projects and how that can feed up into our people strategy and inform what's happening at a central level.
Great, yeah. So John, how about at BAE Systems? You're obviously very different company, different industry, different types of work. I presume perhaps your approach is rather different to looking at that workforce segmentation.
Yeah, I think, and in a company like BAE Systems, there's everybody doing everything. So the functions, the big functions like engineering are doing very detailed planning around skills, etc. I guess what we tried to do was to take a risk-based approach. So by asking the businesses linked to their planning process to identify the areas in which they saw greatest change, greatest risk, linking to what Jill and Wendy have said around, the risk environment. We would focus in on those groups and not try to plan everything. But okay, HR needs to do a bit of planning, but it probably won't bring the company down if we don't, plan every detail of every HR hire for the next 10 years. In engineering, project management, procurement, it certainly could. So risk-based approach, looking at those changing and growing areas. But underneath that, there was detail, and you can't get away from it in this field of work, I don't think. Trying to create that detail to build up a picture of whether you have a capability or not is difficult work. I might come back to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and also just to come back to this question about how you measure the level of capability you have, coming back to the looking at the current state of what you have today, and getting a handle around what the level of capability is that then can help you work out where the gap might be. I think one of the questions that's coming out, certainly came out of the research and in the chat as well, is how to measure that in a way that's kind of realistic and actionable, and doesn't take you down, as Wendy said, down a route of very sort of bureaucratic skills, lists of skills that are very difficult to keep up to date. So I just wonder, Emma, any insights from you around how you've sort of got your arms around what the level of capability in those particular groups is?
It's something we found really hard, if I'm honest. We don't have a kind of central log of what skills individuals have and how they're evolving. So we do have to make assumptions based on job descriptions, job families, etc. And also we use a lot of LinkedIn insights to see what we can pull from there. Obviously, there are limitations with that around what people share on their profiles, but that's our main kind of sources in terms of identifying.
Okay, I'm Emma, you're cutting in and out for me.
Sorry,
hopefully we'll maybe come back to Emma. I mean, I think John, do you have a comment on that particular question, assessing your current capability levels?
Yeah, I think what we did was we looked at sort of big capabilities, like the capability to design and build a fast jet, because that was one of the things we did, or to design and build a nuclear submarine, or to design and build a warship. So, those were the big capabilities that we were, working with the government on. And underneath that, and we needed to combine databases. There was no one place where we had all the information. The thing that worked in our favor was quite often, if you're working in those fields, you need to record. You need to know who's qualified to work on a nuclear submarine before you let them at it. So you do have databases around that. We had to combine databases. I think a really useful thing that the teams did was to use heat maps. So they would look at the skills involved in, say, designing and building a fast jet, and then look out in time to say, what's happening to the demand for that skill over time, and therefore how would that skill decay if we don't have new work for it, and go from sort of green, amber to red to show when those skills would become unsustainable. And in fact, we use that with government, and I'm not claiming all of this for the strategic workforce planning process, but we were part of this process. This was a big company process, but we use that with government to say, can you see, we'll show you these heat maps, can you see that unless you do something to invest in your national capability here, it will decay, and once you've lost it in those kinds of complex fields, you can't get it back easily. If a shipyard closes, it doesn't reopen normally. You've lost the capability. And I was quite pleased, I've left BAE now, but to see quite recently the government announcing investment in future AIR programs, which came directly from that kind of work, to be able to show them. And when government is showed to say, you know, do you understand what you're doing? You will have no national capability, you know, gets people to sit up and think. And that's kind of action on a grand level. There was other more granular action that we were able to prompt through the work at a more local, you know, inside the business level. But the heat map showing the skills was a really great tool.
Thanks, John. Emma, hopefully we can bring you back in. But a question for you specifically, really around using LinkedIn. I mean, certainly what I hear from people is that's not necessarily ideal and not necessarily the most straightforward to be able to extract that information from LinkedIn. Can you maybe just briefly share how you do it and what that gives you in terms of you know, information that you can work with?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're in a similar place around, we know it's not always the ideal to use there, but at the moment we don't have any other alternative right now. So what we do is kind of use LinkedIn to enable us to understand what skills we have in our current workforce at Tesco, but then also what skills exist in the external labour market as well. And through LinkedIn, we're able to get a bit of a sense of what skills are growing, decreasing, where do they exist across the country, and that helps us inform decisions around location of work, what we invest into from a upskilling and capability perspective. So yeah, we found it helpful in terms of the work that we're doing at the moment, but I do agree there are limitations with it in terms of what we are able to do.
Okay, so I think one of the points that's come out of the research and also the chat that's come up today as well is how we, you know, strategic workforce planning can be a rather bureaucratic process if we're not careful. And what organisations are demanding today, particularly in the light of COVID, is more agility, flexibility, being able to develop adaptable plans that can be flexed in line with changing business issues and requirements. And so the way that we approach strategic workforce planning has to reflect that need for agility. So I'd like to sort of change tack and maybe talk about that a bit more. So Wendy, can we come back to you? And I know you've done a lot of thinking around this and have some ideas to share around, you know, how we might build more adaptability and flexibility into how we do strategic workforce planning.
Thanks, Gillian. Yes, so it boils down to planning for uncertainty, and I can see in the chat it's already on people's minds. And in a short few minutes, I'd just like to remind people of some of the methods that we do have for addressing uncertainty, for increasing agility. Some of these methods are pretty well established, but they're not used as much as they could be, perhaps. So particularly for those who are new to this, there are a lot of you today who are a bit new to this. Perhaps this session just gives you a few clues to things to chase up in more detail in the report, or through reading, or through attending other sessions. But I'd like to start by saying people still think workforce planning is perhaps something they'll do when life is a little uncertain. Life is more certain. People say, well, we can't quite do our planning this year because we're still reorganizing, or we're in the middle of a big transformation, so we'll do it next year. And I think that really is a fundamental misunderstanding. The people who've developed workforce planning, initially they were statisticians, so they did a huge amount of work on uncertainty. It was based on that method of saying, you know, we are planning in an uncertain future. And that has become ever more the case. I think the other response I see from some people is just to say, well, our people have to be more flexible. But that really doesn't give you an agenda for action, I don't think, and is just passing the buck to an employee without telling them how to be flexible. So let's just, again, go back to Gillian's diagram, if I can. Good. So let's have a little look at where you can graft fairly well-established methods onto the framework that we're talking about today that just help you deal with uncertainty in some specific ways. And I think the first one, these are not in order of importance, they're to some degree in order of unusualness, perhaps. I think it's really important whenever you're doing the sort of mid-ground workforce planning, not with the big unknowns, but with the stuff you more or less know about, that you're never dealing with a single projection. You're always saying, what if? And some of the important what ifs are, what if the business grows faster or slower than we're expecting? Another really big what if is, what if the labour market is more heated or cooler than we're expecting? So, for example, over the next year, are you going to lose an awful lot of people who will jump job as soon as they feel they can, who've stayed with you through a very difficult period, because from a labour market and personal point of view, it just wasn't a good time to be leaving jobs? So that's sort of what ifs. That means whenever you're looking at gaps, at risks, at how do we fill it, you're always saying, well, we could need between, you know, 100 and 200 people doing this. We could need that skill most of all, or this skill most of all. We're not just working on a single projection. That's the sort of initial start point. Many of you probably do already use contingency planning, not just on the workforce, but on the business too. Where are there things that may well happen that you need to sift in terms of their risk? And what this looks like is sometimes a bit like that. You're looking at risks which may be business ideas, or they may be specifically people risks. You're looking at the likelihood of that risk, and you're looking at the impact of it. So, you know, it gives me no pleasure to say we knew that the likelihood of a pandemic was reasonably high. We knew the impact would be cataclysmic, but we still hadn't quite got round to addressing it. In more simple terms, if you think of all the sectors affected by Brexit, you know, we should have known that our seafood sector was going to get into trouble, and they have responded very well, but they could have planned better. It's not something that was bound to happen, but it was something that could well happen. And in workforce terms, again, this idea of risk, always central. We're planning for the people risks that are both fairly likely, but in particular will have a really big impact if they occur. We're watching the ones that are important, but perhaps less likely. And there are a lot where on the high risk, but low impact, where we're watching and we'll respond if we need to, the more tactical response, but they're not massive risks for our business. I know many of you are doing this all the time. I think sometimes managers are unaware they need to do it with people in the same way they do it with business. Back to the main diagram, the third method is scenario planning. People sometimes talk about scenario planning as though it's just what ifs. It isn't actually, especially as developed by companies like Shell over many years. Scenario planning looks at very different views of the future, often of really big unknowns, the big unknown unknowns, with a view to stress testing the business strategy as well as the resourcing strategy. So examples of that at the moment might be things like the pace of real change on climate change action. You know, how big is that really going to be for your business? Where's it going to hit? And then you get down to, so which functions, which parts of the workforce, which sorts of activities. The whole consumer trends about town centres versus staying online seems to be another present one. If you're a really big retailer, you're really into 5-10 years out, possibly quite different business scenarios. You don't know which of those will come to pass. It's not in your control, but you need to know how big that effect will be on the business. A fourth one which we do intuitively, but we don't often voice when we talk to managers enough, is what we may call adaptive planning, where we're not sure something is becoming clearer. They are shorter cycle loops of planning, acting, reviewing, either because the workforce context is shifting, often because the external context is shifting, very often because business priorities are actually shifting. One of the ones I'm thinking about at the moment in relation to this is this whole business of what we're going to do with offices. I know some organizations that are developing very top-down views of what they're doing with their estate when everyone comes back to work or no one comes back to work in an office. I think our social attitudes to office working are going to be very emergent over the next year, 2 years, 5 years. And if I were an organization, I'd be using a much more adaptive approach to hybrid working. We're all going to be feeling our way to how is where people work, what technology they work with, how that's going to be evolving. We can be running experiments on that. Some organizations already are. We will need to feel our way through the huge impact that the experience of the last year or two will have on our offices and our contracts of employment, and therefore where people are employed, all of those things. The final one I want to touch on, perhaps the most important of all, is how we build agility into our actions. And I just want to remind you, again, well-trodden territory in some ways, that there are a number of ways we can do it, and we don't always attend to the ones that can help us the most. The UK, in particular, compared with other countries, has lent very heavily on numerical flexibility, on flexing the numbers of people we have doing things through extra hours, through a contingent workforce, particularly through outsourcing, where you give someone else the problem of flexing numerically. It can work brilliantly. It can work for the organization and for the individuals. It doesn't always work for both sides. And I think we're going to see quite a lot of hit back against some of the working practices that numerical flexibility has led to. We've already seen it with some big legal cases in the last few weeks. The UK has possibly, in some sectors, underplayed functional flexibility. There is enormous business benefit in having people who have had rather wider experiences and who can do more things, and also then feel braver to be able to do more things. We've seen it in manufacturing with multi-skilled engineers, but there are many sectors where we over-design narrow jobs and then we put very narrow people into very narrow jobs. Those people can do way more. So those of you who were posting comments earlier about how do we know what the capability of our workforce is, the answer is you don't, because you haven't even tried. You know, people can become much more capable than we think, and we've seen a lot of that the last year. And there are cheap ways of doing that. We're talking about job rotation, we're talking about broader, more generic work roles. We can come back to that in questions if you like. There are cheap and very beneficial ways of making your workforce more functionally flexible. We have temporal flexibility about when individuals work, hours of work in one location, hours of work around the globe on different time zones, which some organizations have used to enormous strategic advantage. We also have spatial flexibility, which used not to be terribly exciting, except when Rolls-Royce sent work to India at night. But of course, with what's happened to us the last year, has become a much bigger issue about what sort of spatial flexibility can we get if people don't have to be in a fixed workplace every day. Does that open up whole new labour markets to us we haven't had before? And finally, I hope I've hinted throughout that there's a lot we can do to improve the change readiness of our workforce. We're going to see a lot of that the next year when we talk about upskilling, reskilling, redeploying in many businesses. If you've got a workforce who are being supported and are up for it, you're in a whole different ball game than if you have people who've just been sat in one job with managers kind of making them feel they can't do much else. That also, of course, relies on the change leadership of your entire management and leadership population. That's a quick canter through just some of the ways we can build more flexibility into the way we do our strategic workforce planning.
Thanks, Wendy. I mean, this is obviously a huge topic, and you know, there's lots of questions and comments around this in the chat as well. I mean, we're unfortunately in the time we've got, so we're only going to be able to scratch the surface on this. But I'd like to go back to Emma, and just, you know, I wonder again if you can sort of bring this to life for Tesco, around, you know, maybe some of the techniques you use for taking a more dynamic approach.
Yeah, definitely. So at Tesco, we have developed what we call a bronze, silver, gold framework to identify how we can be a bit more agile in applying workforce planning. So through that framework, it enables us to dial up and dial down the process based on the needs of that function. So it might be, for example, for a gold project, the function is facing really significant internal and external disruption. So we need to do a full workforce planning project for them, and it might need some significant investment into that area off the back of that work. We then have a slightly scaled down approach for the silver, and then for the bronze, it might be for functions that are not facing so much the external disruption, but are facing internal disruption based on, for example, changes in our operating model. So taking a bit of an agile approach to scale down how we approach workforce planning to enable a quicker delivery if it's required for that business area.
Yes, that's right. And I think what we've also seen in during the pandemic is organisations using the kind of principles and the thinking underpinning strategic workforce planning in a very much a pared back way to replan things quite dynamically in response to changing situations. So again, maybe that's something that you've experienced too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we had to recruit thousands of delivery drivers and additional customer assistants into our store in a very short period of time, and having to forecast using the kind of scenario approach that we've talked about already today, taking that scenario approach to think about how can we bring those colleagues into our business effectively so that we can make sure that we're fair both for the business but also for the colleagues themselves in terms of having the right contracts in place and the right agreements in place so that we have a sustainable business model. So definitely taking that scenario approach through the pandemic to forecast out how we could respond.
Yeah, absolutely. And another point that's been coming out in the chat is, you know, perhaps we might look in particular parts of the business where we know there are heat maps, and I think the heat map idea is a really sort of helpful one. But also, I think it was Ulrich made the point around there may be cross-organizational themes that have to be coordinated across a wider group, perhaps across functions or across levels. So, you know, how do you handle that when something clearly is a theme that resonates across different parts of the business?
So I think that's as much around playing almost a central coordination role in the workforce planning team to be the eyes and ears of the business and feed that into the central people strategy. So what can we see across the different departments that we're working with, and how can we make sure that that's reflected in the people strategy and the people priorities that we're focusing on? So I guess our role in that is coordinating all of that insight together and helpfully playing it back to the relevant teams that will respond to the themes that are coming across the business in a cross-functional way.
Yeah, and I think one of the other models that we saw, and just to respond to Martin's point in the chat about how you tackle SWP at the sort of whole organisation versus a business unit level. One model that we saw in the research is actually a lot of the core of the activity around strategic workforce planning might happen actually at business unit levels, and might actually be the responsibility of HR business partners working with their leadership teams in different business units. And then the role of the central coordinating team is more about, one, it's about methodology and tools and processes, but it's also about, coordinating those common themes and making sure that there's sufficient focus at the organizational level, for those sort of emerging themes that are common.
Yeah, and that's what we're looking at the moment in terms of how can we start to trial some of that business-led approach rather than it all necessarily sitting centrally.
Yeah, so I'd like to. I mean, I think we've got about 7 minutes left in our time together. So I think I mean, clearly there are so many topics that we could talk about. I'd like to, can we bring all of our panelists back onto the screen, and I'd like to just go around everyone and maybe have a kind of final thought based on what you've heard, the questions that have come out of the discussion. I mean, John, maybe to start with you, I think one of the things that we haven't really talked about, but was really an important theme from the research, was the challenge of making strategic workforce planning fly in the organisation and getting key stakeholders on board, and it's not an easy thing to get right, and often it takes a couple of attempts to really make it successful. So I wonder if you just have some insights to share. What did it take to build HR's credibility around this, to get the business to buy into to making this happen?
No, it's a good question, and it's not easy. And even in an environment like BA Systems, which was a planning company, the massive project-based company, I guess some of the resistance was people said, well, we already do planning. Why do we need to do more planning? To make that argument, so this is a different kind of planning, maybe a different time horizon, maybe some a more strategic aspect. We didn't call it strategic workforce planning. I think you mentioned that, don't know why, but the term turned people off and got people against it. So I just have to check my own notes to see what we did call it: long-term skills analysis and workforce planning, which is a bit of a mouthful, but people didn't like the other term. We did benchmark, we went out and benchmarked and looked at what other people do in this area, so that I think we designed a process which was, which looked good, was good. I did have support of the boss that challenged me to say, how can you assure me that I'm not walking towards a cliff edge, was his kind of analogy for it. Support of the boss is not often enough, because businesses don't always slavishly follow what the big boss says. And then we went into the businesses, and I guess we worked with where the energy was. So year one, not every business fully, I mean, they all did something because they kind of had to, but not every business really did something serious with it. But then we highlighted what the good ones did, and the air sector business, which was a more sophisticated business, did some great work with it, had war rooms set up to show people all the charts, etc., of how the skills were moving and developing, the functions were all engaged. And we used that as the poster child to get the others involved. And I think it was a kind of a 2-year cycle, 2 runs of it, before everybody started to get a bit more serious about it.
Yeah, okay. Jill, just under you've been, from hearing the rest of the conversation, is there a particular point that you would like to highlight as getting started really to focus on?
Yeah, I think I'm very mindful that when I work with organisations, it's very often the first attempt that they've made at strategic workforce planning. And so for me, it implies doing this work well implies building a leadership muscle that in many businesses is underdeveloped. So, I love the idea of the gold, silver, bronze structure that Emma described. but choosing where you start and starting small and starting in a way that's focused on building skill and changing the conversation rather than inserting lots of process. For my observation is that's always the most fruitful way to begin. So if you create the appetite by changing the conversation, then embellishing the process subsequently becomes much easier.
Yep. Okay. And Emma, maybe a top tip from you. This is something that's, I guess, fairly new for Tesco. It's a capability you've been building over the last few years. If you were to have your time again and sort of think about where's the best place to start, do you have a practical suggestion?
I think you've got to go with effectively when we started workforce planning, it was almost, where's the biggest burning platform that you need to respond to? How can you make sure that that area that you focus on first is almost self-contained, so you're not trying to boil the ocean? And then how can you use that to build momentum from there? So we get a lot of business leaders referring to the area that we helped through strategic workforce planning in the past, and they say to us, we want what they had, please, because that kind of message has got out in terms of the success that we had in that area of the business and how we built momentum from there.
Great. Okay. I think we're in our last minute before we're due to finish off. Just a couple of things I'd like to point out before we go. First, just to say, if this is a topic that you'd like to explore further, we've actually got 2 sessions next week by our sponsors of this research. So on Tuesday at lunchtime, Oracle is going to be running a session, strategic workforce management, more than just headcount. So, and I'm sure they'll be going into more around the kind of how we measure and track skills as part of that. And then on Thursday, the 22nd, there's a session by Mercer talking about how to approach strategic workforce planning. So the details of those will be included in the post-meeting notes and recording, which we'll be sending out over the next couple of days. So all that remains for me now is to say thank you very much to all of our speakers. Wendy, thanks for sharing your top tip. Sorry, we couldn't quite get to you before time ran out, but thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to all of the audience for joining us. We hope you found that useful, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.